Are we recording this? Yes, we are. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Good morning, and welcome to this organized symposium on achieving agricultural sustainability. Thanks to Will Martin for doing the legwork in organizing this and mobilizing an excellent panel that we will hear from shortly. Overall, there is a broad consensus that the current food system is broken, or as some say, not fit for purpose. And with climate change already affecting us and the food system significantly, the issues of resilience, sustainability have bubbled up to the surface like never before. Yet we have still a way to go to solve the food security problem, compelling us to keep our eyes focused on the issue of food production, primarily through productivity. Yet achieving the needed transformation, which is now widely recognized and agreed, for example, at the UN Food System Summit and COP26 and many other global fora, has proven to be a difficult task. What does it take to achieve a more productive, resilient, and sustainable food system? A complex and challenging task with many different entry points, it is still a critical and fundamental issue that it faces a critical and fundamental issue that needs to be confronted. And that is the constraint to achieving the transformation in the form of agricultural policy. For sure, agriculture is far from a neglected sector. Governments around the world provide significant amount of resources to agriculture, as we will soon find out from our presenters. But is this support provided in the most appropriate way to facilitate the transformation that we need in our food system? If not, is there a way to improve it? And how might we want to reshape the policy and support provided to agriculture? To answer these weighty questions, we have in this session 4 outstanding speakers to give us some scene-setting presentations based on research at the 4 international organizations, FAO, IFPRI, OECD, and the World Bank. Each of these closely related presentations will focus on a different aspect of the problem of reforming agricultural policies to increase sustainability, with particular attention to the problem of greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture, while recognizing the critical importance of other goals such as poverty, nutrition, and impacts on nature. I won't go through the titles. I'll announce the titles of the different presentations as we go through the speakers. We'll start off by looking at what sustainability means to different people. And the first presentation by Leanne Jackson from the OECD is focused on mapping national sustainability standards, insights into policies and practices for sustainable agriculture. It aims to develop insights into the diverse ways that countries are dealing with agricultural sustainability in relation to trade. Through the mapping of country policies, practices, and experiences, it will identify how countries are defining and measuring and managing sustainability with a view of identifying areas of commonality and of divergence. Leanne is head of the Agro-Food Trade and Markets Division at the OECD's Trade and Agriculture Directorate. She leads the work on examining the links between policies and outcomes on food and agriculture markets, including specific analyses related to modeling medium-term outlook for commodity markets, understanding policies from a food systems perspective, and enhancing the transparency and predictability of agricultural trade. She has over 20 years of experience working in the area of trade and agriculture, including 16 at the WTO, where she served as secretary to the Committee on Agriculture, advising WTO members on issues related to agricultural trade policy and multilateral negotiations. And she was previously a research fellow at the School of Economics at the University of Adelaide in South Australia, and also a researcher at IFPRI. Over to you, Leanne.
Great, thank you so much, Madhur, and it's been really a pleasure to be part of this seminar. Like you said, I'm going to focus on OECD work in the area of agricultural sustainability, and I'll have a trade focus because I want to highlight the direction a bit of where the OECD is headed in this area, because as you mentioned, it's a space that is really moving very quickly, and I'll highlight a little bit some of the insights we've had about new innovations in terms of tracking sustainability outcomes as well. So I'm going to share my screen, which we practice. And I think you can see that now.
Yep.
Yes, okay. So in this presentation, what I would like to do is sort of draw together some threads of OECD research that my colleagues are doing in the Agri-Food Trade and Markets Division within the Trade and Ag Directorate at the OECD. We've done a lot of work over the past few years on food systems, where we've really shaped this narrative around how food systems have to do multiple objectives. Like Madhur said in his introduction, we're expecting food systems to provide food security for sure, but more and more we're having conversations about environmental sustainability in relation to food systems. And also there's always an aspect that is linked to livelihoods and making sure that actors within food systems are having a good livelihood to continue in the sector. A significant share of the global environmental pressures come from agriculture. So what we've seen recently, again, as was said in the introduction, is that countries are starting to adopt very diverse approaches for promoting agricultural sustainability, in particular in relation to trade, and I'll highlight a bit of that. But we also see that the private sector is increasingly using sustainability standards. And I wanted to highlight some of this because there's an interface between what the public sector is doing and what the private sector is doing, and big questions around how to be efficient in terms of achieving the sustainability objectives. So, so we have this work on food systems. I'll highlight just a little bit of our work on outlook projections for agricultural commodity markets and how that helps us think about trade-offs, and then focus on the direction of the work that we're moving towards in my division. So in the next biennium, we'll have a big project that will be exactly mapping out these diverse practices across different member countries of the OECD and other partners to try to see if we can come up with some guidance for where we could maybe make efforts to harmonize across different country approaches. So just to kind of motivate this a little bit, a lot of the research is really aimed at understanding the global impacts of domestic measures. Of course, when we're talking about climate change, we know we're talking about collective action. We know all efforts are needed across the board from different countries, and we're measuring greenhouse gas emissions. But we also know that there are other kinds of global impacts that we're trying to seek. So this graph shows a result that comes from our outlook projections of agricultural commodity markets. And the point that we're trying to make with this kind of information is that we need trade. We need trade to be working because we see that over the next decade, there'll be increasing specialization. Importers who are currently importing are expected to import more. So you can see that on the left-hand side of the screen, which the graph shows net trade across different regions. And those that are exporting actually are expected to increase their exports. So we need to pay attention to making sure that the trading system works if we want to achieve our food security objectives. So that's one of these triple challenges for the food sector. But we also know that trade can have negative impacts, and we need to think about when policymakers are implementing measures, what are the impacts on trade, and then spilling that over into what we think is the impact on sustainability outcomes. Now, what we've seen through some of our consultations with members, we had a workshop in the middle of the year, in June of this year, where we had a sharing of experiences with countries. And you can see that there's diversity even among the OECD membership. So often there's the perception that among OECD members, it's less diverse, but in fact, there's quite a lot of diversity. And we see a lot of countries still want to make sure when we're talking about sustainability, we're inclusive. So we're talking across the 3 dimensions of sustainability, not just environmental sustainability. And increasingly countries are adding in wanting to be able to have something to say about nutrition and health, and also the resilience of the sector. So measures are focusing on a wide basket of outcomes, and yet still what we notice with countries is sustainability can be used as a shorthand for specific focus on environmental outcomes. So one of the lessons that we take away from that is you have to be really clear when you're talking about sustainability that you're actually using the same definition. In the workshop, we also had a lot of discussion about measurement, and this is interesting, and I'll circulate, I'll come back to it towards the end of the presentation. Building on what we think we mean when we say sustainable, that's going to have an impact on what we want to measure in terms of outcomes, of course. So we might be looking at food security or livelihoods or environmental outcomes. But there's also this issue of scale. So as soon as you're talking about sustainability, some countries that we see are drawing smaller boundaries in terms of where they want to actually get sustainable outcomes, and other countries are thinking about a much broader or even global impact. So you have to be very clear when you're talking about measurement, what kind of geographies you're talking about. And then in addition, there's the social and market context of each country. And so in terms of what countries are deciding to measure, that will be a function of where the priority of their public sector is. So we had, for example, we had an example from Switzerland where they were really focusing quite a bit on food loss and waste, for example. So they had lots of measurements around food loss and waste and how that can contribute to sustainability. And this affects the way Switzerland engages when we talk about sustainability across the whole OECD measurement membership. And then finally, when you think about public sector measures and the way the public sector is trying to manage policies to incentivize sustainable outcomes, however they're defined, we can see that there's a wide range of policies. And I'm sure we'll hear a bit more when we get into some of the discussions around repurposing support. Members are investing in innovation, moving towards trying to come up with better measures and incentives for sustainable productivity growth. Members are starting to implement mandatory labeling schemes, including, for example, in France, where they're considering implementing something like an eco score, where all food products will be required to have a ranking of how well they do within environmental outcomes. There are direct incentives to farmers, of course. I'll talk in a minute about this issue of responsible business conduct and how that contributes to the definitions around sustainability. And then the sort of flashpoint in some areas is that some countries are actually including sustainability objectives into their trade agreements. So again, not to pick on Switzerland, but we also have seen that Switzerland in a trade agreement with Indonesia has included provisions in there where in order to have imports into Switzerland from Indonesia, there needs to be a demonstrated sustainability criteria that is met. So you can see wide variety of issues that are coming across. And the goal of our research in the next biennium is going to be to set up a framework where we can start to think about all these diverse measures across a common framework. So just to touch a little bit on what we're also seeing in the private sector. So we have a lot of work on supply chain initiatives in my division, and we've seen three broad trends. So consumers are increasingly demanding information, and a lot of retailers are starting to respond. So when a retailer the size of Walmart decides that it wants to make sure that all the providers into Walmart are actually satisfying environmental criteria, that's going to have a big pull effect to get change into food systems. So again, circling back to this theme of food systems transformation that Madhur included in his introduction. There's also a real trend towards responsible investing and reporting requirements. So we're seeing more and more cases where firms are expected to be able to show in their annual reports, for example, what they're doing in terms of their environmental outcomes. And here, actually, what's interesting is there's also a trend towards some types of harmonization across this responsible investment and reporting. And finally, we're seeing a real acceleration in technological breakthroughs in terms of tracking information. And here, this is, I think, one of the big things to think about when we're thinking about measuring and doing research in this area information. There's tons of information. It's being collected across a wide variety of products, of countries, and it's lowering the costs of actually moving towards traceability, which then creates opportunities for linking some producers in international markets to other markets where there's consumers who might be willing to pay a bit more for environmental outcomes. Turning quickly, because I've got my eye on the clock, just to mention this issue of the public-private interface. The OECD does quite a bit of work with the FAO on responsible business conduct. And here, what I think is interesting is it's providing guidance for firms in terms of what they should do, not just for environment, but since we're talking a lot about environment today, in terms of environmental outcomes and what firms should do in terms of embedding responsible business conduct into their own management systems. And what's interesting here is that there are countries who are moving towards requiring or recommending firms or businesses who are coming in and doing business within their domestic markets to satisfy these responsible business conduct guidelines. So in a sense, this type of activity, even within the OECD, gets a lot of attention because it moves towards a harmonization of what kinds of things we're asking firms to do, what kinds of information we're asking them to provide in order to reassure that they're actually having environmentally positive outcomes. So finally, what we've noticed actually is this issue of tracking sustainability has been really accelerating, and we think that this could really shape a lot of the transformation going forward. There's a growing availability of data and evidence. Of course, this also means we need to find new ways of synthesizing that data and evidence to take better decisions. There's also a move towards having very clearly defined expectations and accepted methodologies, both for the public sector and the private sector. There's an increasing adoption of supply chain perspective, which is interesting because a decade or two ago, the focus was really on the process of producing products. And now there's efforts to do measurement of environmental impacts all along the different parts of supply chains. And there's lots of technology that's now becoming available to actually measure impacts at the ground level, so to speak, and the effectiveness of policies and private sector interventions in terms of achieving these environmental objectives. So before, there wasn't so much granular data in terms of knowing what the outcome was. Now with the granular data, there may be an opportunity to better match policies with methods to achieve those particular outcomes and to be able to see the connection between the policy intervention and the outcome that you see on the ground. Of course, we still have coverage gaps. We have some work that we have to do across thinking about the relative importance of domestic and global supply chains in terms of getting to our sustainability objective outcomes. But this is the direction where we're headed. In my division, we're going to be working a lot more on trying to synthesize information across the OECD membership for what members are doing in this area, because we see it as a space where there's a lot of acceleration. Thanks.
Thank you, Leanne. A good reality check that even when we have a lot of common understanding on where we want to go, getting there is not quite as easy. Just defining some basic issues gets to be in the way. And how do you go about doing that? Clearly a very, very important agenda going forward. Let's move on to the next presentation. And the second one draws on model-based simulations prepared by FAO's flagship State of Food and Nutrition in 2022 report, the report on the state of food and nutrition, food security and nutrition. And it examines the approaches to improving food security and nutrition while contributing to resilience and climate objectives. To speak to this topic, we have Marco Sanchez, who is probably the best placed to address these issues. Marco is Deputy Director of Agri-Food Economics at FAO, where he directs the reports on state of food security and nutrition in the world and the state of food and agriculture. Previously, he was Senior Economist at the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs and an economist at the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean. And he has also been a consultant to various organizations, UNDP, pre-IADB, and has supported lecturing and research at International Institute for Social Studies at Erasmus University in the Netherlands, National University of Costa Rica, and Tilburg University in the Netherlands. Marco, over to you.
Many thanks, Madhur. Introduction and colleagues, happy to be with you, exchanging ideas on such a difficult topic as it relates to any kind of support, in this case for food and agriculture, where we are going to be focusing on. Let me share my screen and move from there. Okay, so I hope this works out well. So as you can see, the title of my presentation is Repurposing Agricultural Support for Better Food Security and Nutrition Outcomes. And it touches upon a number of issues that we have already started talking about in this session. I'm happy to be part of the session. I think it's a very stimulating collection of presentations that somehow I see the connection between them. Yeah, this what I will be presenting today draws upon the background material that some of us worked on for the State of Food Security and Nutrition in the World, the SOFI Report 2022. And I acknowledge here the contributions of FPRI colleagues, David Laborde and Joseph Glover, on the modeling part, where we had a collaboration to produce some new results. Let me just show you the picture that motivated this SOFI. Well, the picture is not a nice picture, you know. World hunger rose again further in 2021. The inequalities widened by the pandemic, made the challenge of eradicating hunger even harder. But importantly, it's not only about hunger, but the food insecurity problem is getting bigger and bigger. Around 2.3 billion people in the world lack access to adequate food in 2021. And that's very important because dietary quality is what takes us to nutrition. And of course, with such problems of food insecurity and hunger, it's not surprising that the world is not on track to achieve global nutrition targets. And what strikes us a lot is the billions of people who cannot afford a healthy diet. It's only in 2020 we observed that 3.1 billion people could not afford a healthy diet. So what we have been trying to do is try to understand not only the drivers of these problems, but also what the solutions could be. And one of the things that we have been talking about is, okay, how about agricultural support policies? What's happening there? How are they related to both the trends and how could they be the solution or part of the solution? And agricultural support policies, as Madhur said in the introduction, are there, and vast transfers are being moved to farmers in the form of agricultural support policies, and it's good to understand what's happening with those transfers. Of course, this policy support has had some good outcomes. You know, they have boosted global food production, particularly staple crops. They have helped reduce hunger and poverty as a result, but there are serious concerns about the impacts on environmental sustainability, on health, and on the efficiency of agri-food systems themselves. What is the good news is that it seems that there is a global consensus or agreement on the need to repurpose agricultural policy support. And what we observed in FAO and then work with the partners of the SOFI report was that there was already a lot of evidence on the impacts on environmental sustainability and also income. But we saw that there was less done in terms of the links between the agricultural support policies and the cost and the affordability of healthy diets. So what we did then in the SOFI was try to take a stock of the support. And I don't want to really expand a lot on this, but the picture is very clear. On the one hand, we can see that about 630 billion US dollars per year on average over the period 2013-2018 were global support to food and agriculture. And what is striking also is that you see the big chunk of this is price incentives that can also be negative, but in the net, most of this support is price incentives, which is very important to keep in mind, because here we are talking about border measures on imports and exports, such as import tariffs, quotas, export taxes, etc., etc. Then you see that what is fiscal subsidies, and this is very important to keep in mind because a lot of people talk about repurposing fiscal subsidies. But this is a smaller component compared to the other support that is being given in the form of price incentives. So you can see that fiscal subsidies are there, and they are mostly given to producers. A less share of the subsidies goes to consumers, which is also important considering the fact that we want to understand what is the association between this policy support and healthy diets. And it also strikes that general services support is about $111 billion per year on average. And this is the type of support that the literature confirms is less distorting and can have medium to longer term productivity gains that we don't see with some other forms of support. One important aspect is that the support differs across country income groups. So it is not surprising that you see most of the support is given by high income countries, right? And you see low income countries that have very, very small shares of the support that is being given. Importantly, price incentives and fiscal subsidies have been the most widely used in high income countries. But we also observe that they are becoming more important or increasingly used or popular across some middle income countries as well, in particular those at the upper level of income. So there are a lot of differences here, and it is important to then refer to what Lina was saying, that not all countries are doing the same thing, you know, depending on where you are in geography, countries are behaving differently. But this is a good picture that is complemented by also the fact that there are not only differences across groups of countries, but also across commodities. So in this graph, you can see that, for example, rice, sugar, and meats of various types are the foods most incentivized worldwide. And this is an important aspect, while producers of fruits and vegetables are less supported overall, or are even penalized in some low-income countries. So there is also, you know, a variation here that one needs to keep in mind when looking at the issue of support and what foods are being received in this. In low-income countries, it is important to mention also that, as you can see here in these areas of the graph, low-income countries and lower middle-income countries, there is some penalization as well, right? And this is because, you know, there is a tendency also to penalize producers and then try to, you know, support more the consumer and the poor, which makes sense in some contexts. Now, what we observe in a nutshell is that fiscal subsidies have significantly contributed to growing production and reducing the prices of staple cereals, beef, and milk. And of course, that has had positive impacts on food security and farm incomes, but also encouraging monocultures and also ceasing the farming of certain nutritious products that are important to make up healthy diets and reduce their costs. In terms of border measures, which is the trade policies that we were listening about in the previous presentation, it's important to understand that some of them target important policy objectives, including food safety. But governments, in our view, could do more to reduce tariff or trade barriers for nutritious foods. Market price controls, such as minimum or administered prices to consumers, particularly in low-income countries and some middle-income countries, target staple commodities as well as sugar. And that, of course, helps to ensure farm incomes and low prices, but it's also contributing to imbalanced diets. Now, we partner up with the IFPRI, with our colleagues, David Labor and Joe Glover, to see some scenarios on repurposing. And here I will not focus on all of them. Basically, I will talk about 4, 5, and 6, and I will show some results very quickly, just one slide that shows how the results deviate from the baseline or business as usual scenario, which is dynamic and goes all the way up to 2028. In one scenario, which is number 4 here, and as well as 5 and 6, we target what we call in the software report high priority for nutrition foods. Those are those foods for which current consumption in different countries is very low compared to the dietary guidelines that that tell us how to eat healthy. So we are trying to reallocate expenditures in order to increase either the production or the consumption or both of those products where there is this gap in nutrition, in consumption that is nutritious. So in the first one, number 4, we reallocate price incentives. to border measures and market price controls toward those priority foods. In the number 5, we reallocate fiscal subsidies that are currently given to producers for priority foods. And number 6 is different. In number 6, we basically take the fiscal subsidies given to producers in order to shift them to consumers of priority foods. And of course, then you get very interesting results. And here, of course, I need to make a disclaimer. The world is not as simple as we are simulating here, because here we're assuming that all countries in the world got united and did the same thing. They all did repurpose in the same direction. So, but it shows how, how the result would come up if the world were supposed to be doing such hypothetical move. And here what you can see in this slide is the repurposing. You have the 3 scenarios that I just described, and you have the results for all of them compared to the baseline. And repurposing fiscal subsidies to producers, let me start with that one, would result in the largest improvement in the affordability of healthy diets. There are also reductions in the percentage of the global population in extreme poverty and in the population experiencing undernourishment. However, this is not free of trade-offs, as you can see in this graph. Total greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture would increase in this hypothetical scenario, reflecting, of course, the higher agricultural production, including high-protein foods, such as dairy products, whose consumption patterns need to be improved to meet dietary levels, particularly in lower middle-income countries. Also, we observe that when you repurpose fiscal subsidies to producers, global farm incomes would fall slightly. And that's an important trade-off because it will affect the livelihoods. Now, on the other hand, repurposing price incentives is interesting. It shows that it would reduce the cost of nutritious foods as the other scenario, but and it would increase the affordability of healthy diets as in the other scenario. But in this case, greenhouse gas emissions would fall almost by 1 percentage point without other trade-offs seen in repurposing fiscal subsidies. For example, here farm income actually increases globally, which is very interesting. Now, last but not least, when you repurpose fiscal subsidies, moving them from producers to consumers, you would see as a result that, of course, there is also a reduced cost and improvement in affordability of healthy diets, which basically tells me that either way, if you do it right, if you try to meet these gaps in consumption towards healthy diets and priority foods, you achieve the objective of reducing the cost and increasing the affordability of healthy diets. But in this case, moving these subsidies from producers to consumers would also lead to reductions in greenhouse gas emissions globally and in several regions and countries. But for many countries, we observe that there could be a significant cost to farm incomes, and those should be looked at. So just very quickly, we also see that many countries, low-income countries, for example, will have very little space to repurpose because they spend very little. And we play with some other country-specific analysis. And I very quickly will explain what we did here. We took, for example, what you see in this graph in the base column is how Ethiopia, in a business as usual scenario, would be spending in agriculture by different priority areas that you see down here. So this is how they spend. So we play with an optimal reallocation of the budget in this way in order to achieve different objectives, such as increasing agri-food GDP, or farm jobs, rural poverty reduction, and reducing the cost of the healthy diet. Just so I don't confuse you, what happened is if you optimally repurpose your budget like this, vis-a-vis this, you would see that you would increase agri-food GDP with the same money, you would increase new jobs by about 489,000, and then you would get 450,000 people out of poverty, and you could also get more than 2 billion households out of the impossibility of affording a healthy diet with the same budget, just optimally repurposing it. So let me finalize then with a couple of considerations. One of the conclusions that we make in the SOF is that repurposing alone will not work, and you will need really to think about how you complement with other systems. Social protection systems, for example, will be very important to mitigate the impact on those who will lose in the process of repurposing, and so on and so forth. You have some other policies that you need to keep in mind, particularly also in the health sector and in the energy sectors and so on and so forth. And I am sure Rob Voss later on will enlighten us more about the political economy and the political context. We also conclude that no matter how much or how well or how optimal you repurpose, you need to take into account the political economic context, and particularly the institutions. Do we have strong institutions that can also engage with stakeholders, including the private sector? That's a question that needs to be tackled. So in a nutshell, we think that because there is a lot of room to repurpose, and because repurposing border measures has a lot of potential to minimize trade-offs, all these commitments and flexibilities of the WTO will need to be taken into account by countries. Also, repurposing of support may not be fully equitable. If some farmers will not be able to specialize in the production of the nutritious foods, so then some support is at stake there as well. And to avoid trade-offs, it may be necessary to step up new fiscal subsidies to consumers rather than moving existing producers' subsidies to the consumer. What we need on the production side is to make those support measures more optimal. And where agriculture is the key to the economy and job generation, like in low-income countries and sub-Saharan Africa, which are still undergoing agricultural transformation, is very important to spend more in a well-prioritized provision of general services, for which international development finance will be needed. I will leave it here because of the time constraint, and I thank you very much.
Thanks, Marco. Sophie continues to push the frontier on knowledge. Thank you. I think it points out that it is possible. One, that the policies and the way we support agriculture has huge implications, including for nutrition and the long-term human capital development and so on, and which eventually affects productivity itself. But that it is also possible, does require a nuanced, detailed, country-level analysis to identify what to do and how to do it. Excellent analysis, thank you. Moving on to the third presentation, we have by Will Martin. It notes the critical importance of reducing agricultural emissions if the rise in global average temperatures is to be kept below 2 degrees. It draws on extensive available quantitative analysis to identify the most promising approaches, combinations of approaches for reducing the impacts of global warming on emissions from agriculture, while recognizing the implications of these policies for food security and poverty. Will is a senior research fellow at in IFPRI's Markets, Trade and Institutions Division, where his main interests are agricultural trade policy, productivity growth, poverty reduction, prioritization of development interventions, and environmental impacts of agricultural support. He is the immediate past president of the International Association of Agricultural Economists, so well known to many of us. I think most of us on this call. And he served as president of the association between 2015 and 18, and was responsible for organizing the highly successful International Conference of Agricultural Economists in Milan in 2015. Prior to joining IFPRI, Will was at the World Bank, where he spent nearly 25 years, last 6 of which were a research manager leading the research team on agricultural and rural development at the bank. His research at the bank has included several edited volumes, including implications of the Uruguay round for developing countries, implications of China's accession to the WTO, and potential implications of Doha development round. His analysis of the food price shock in 2007-8 was influential in highlighting the impacts of the crisis on the poor and shaping the World Bank's policy response to this crisis. And according to Google Scholar, his research has been cited over 14,000 times. So let's see what Will has to say on the recent research that IFPRI and I think jointly with the World Bank has undertaken. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Madhur, for that very kind introduction, and for very kindly offering to run through my slides when we discovered that presentation problem. So, but the key set of issues here are very strongly related, actually, to those raised by Leanne and Marco, and the ones that will come up in Rob's presentation shortly. What's to be done about greenhouse emissions from agriculture? Next slide, please. So the motivation. Oh my goodness, it's we see the whole slide. Yeah, greenhouse gas emissions are an important source of global emissions. I think they don't really get anything like the attention that those from transport, electricity, and industry receive. And there's another big difference here, that traditional approaches to mitigation, like the economists' favourite, but not politicians' favourite, carbon taxes, are much less effective for emissions from agriculture than they are from emissions from combustion. So what are the options for reducing agricultural emissions? And then how do they compare in reducing emissions and in achievement of other goals? Because as Leanne and Marco have pointed out, we can't just focus solely on emission reduction. We really have to consider the impacts on other critical issues, poverty reduction, and nutrition, economic efficiency, a whole set of other goals we need to consider. So if we look at agricultural emissions, agriculture and land use change emissions, they account for about 20% of total emissions. So this is greater than the emissions from transport, greater than the emissions from industry and manufacturing, smaller than electricity. But it's very, very clear that if we don't do something about this 20% of emissions, it used to be 40%, 30% rather of global emissions, but the recent FAO work has shown that it's declined relatively, but it's still very, very large, and we've simply got to do something about it. Next slide, please. They're also highly concentrated. The largest part by far comes from enteric fermentation, from ruminants, and the methane emissions from rice. By comparison, the part of emissions from pig, poultry and eggs and other cereals, from fertilizer, related to fertilizer and so on, is, while important, is much, much smaller. So there's a possibility really for targeting for emissions by focusing on the most emission intensive products and processes. Next slide, please. Not only are these emissions important, but they're liable to grow very rapidly. If we look, these are projections out to 2040 done using the Maragradep model at IFPRI. David Laborde has done these projections looking forward. If you look at the bottom right there, agricultural production emissions are liable to go up over that period from 5.8 gigatons of carbon dioxide equivalent to 9.1. Quite dramatic. Land use and land use change, including the sequestration by standing forests, is actually likely to be relatively small and a net negative because of the sequestration and the limited scope for rapid deforestation of the type that we've seen in the past. We're likely in these projections, and these projections track poverty reduction, nutritional cost of a healthy diet, and other goals, as well as emissions. By looking at the household level, we're liable to see some reduction in poverty from 8.2% to 7.2%, but nothing like the dramatic reductions we've seen over the last 40 years, from 40-odd% down to under 10%. Of the world in poverty at $1.90 a day. So emissions are going up. 80% of that growth is going to come from livestock and rice. There's some agricultural land use expansion, a small percentage, but a large number of hectares. Thank you. Next slide. So importance, agriculture and land use change, larger than industry, larger than transport, almost certainly not possible to stabilize the climate without reducing these emissions. 50% of these emissions come from CH4 and N2O, my apologies. Unlike CO2, they don't last forever. They're super potent on human timescales, and reducing them could really help reduce global warming quickly. There's a realization of this in the Methane Pledge in the recent climate change conference. Next slide, please. So broad options for emission reduction. One obvious one is carbon taxes. They're very much favoured by economists. Another option, and this touches on the issues raised by Marco, is the changing support distortions. What about making support uniform? What about shifting support to low emission products? To the extent that we have subsidies targeted to beef and dairy production, these might be potent in terms of reducing emissions. There's also another set of important interventions, regulation and conditionality that focus on changing producers, shifting producers away from more emission intensive production to less privately profitable but lower emission technologies. And that can be done by direct regulatory fiat. It can be done by making payments conditional. You get your support if you do this, the way Europe is proposing with its goals on increasing organic agriculture and reducing fertilizer and pesticides. Or you can link it to payments for environmental services. And then the final option we consider, and this is based on the work that Madhur mentioned, the work that we did with the bank earlier this year, invest for green innovations that both reduce emissions and increase competitiveness, increase the private efficiency of production. Next slide, please. There are three channels of effect for emissions from combustion of fossil fuels. One is the incentive to change the technique to low emission techniques. So if there's a carbon tax and you can use coal, you can use petroleum products, you can use natural gas, you can use sustainable in low emission technologies, you're going to change your technique at any level of output away from the carbon intensive and hence heavily taxed products, interventions, technologies towards low emission technologies. There's going to be an incentive for R&D to develop new and more efficient techniques. And we're seeing this, for instance, in transport with electric cars. And we're seeing incentives there'll also be incentives to reduce output of emission intensive goods. Carbon tax on gasoline, for instance, will reduce use of consumption of fuel. Problem is, there's much less suited, the carbon tax approach seems much less suited for agriculture than for combustion. Most emissions are dispersed and unmonitorable process emissions. And carbon taxes, therefore, are going to only work through the output channel and possibly through R&D, but only if carbon taxes are reduced as technology improves. The other problem with carbon taxes is they're politically challenged because of impacts on competitiveness. Taxing demand rather than production may help. Next slide, please. There are some very interesting studies of carbon taxes at the national level that look at potential leakage. A study from Iowa State by Dumortier and Elabade note leakage can be reduced by carbon border adjustments. And they can reduce incentives. Carbon border adjustments are going to reduce incentives to increase production and land use in the rest of the world. And that, I think, is an important issue that's received too little attention on border adjustment policies. There's a very interesting global study by Henderson and Verma from OECD. It concludes that carbon taxes, even on some countries, not all, reduce emissions. But leakage rates are smaller as more countries are covered. They're larger when only a few countries are covered. They do an ambitious simulation that gets about a 600 megaton reduction. It's about close to 10% in agricultural emissions with $100 a ton CO2 equivalent in 2050. But that requires very broad coverage. It requires coverage of OECD, China, other East Asia and Brazil. And the emission reductions there depend critically on changes to lower emission technologies. And that's where I worry about whether we can achieve those with these dispersed process emissions. Emissions fall by a factor of 4. Emission reductions fall by a factor of 4 when there's no incentive for change of technique. Next slide, please. So Key question then, what are the effects of removing support? And these are questions that we analysed in the World Bank IFRI study that Madhur mentioned. Remove all domestic budget support, remove all domestic and market price support. Can we reallocate support, making subsidies uniform, shifting away from emission technologies, intensive technology? What about if we change production technology to reduce emissions using conditionality, reduce emission intensive input use, and repurpose for green innovation? So there you invest in R&D for technologies that reduce emission intensity and raise productivity. Next slide, please. Removal, and just to foreshadow the results, removal or rearrangement. What we find of support, we don't get game-changing reductions in emissions. If we use environmental conditionality, it's good for the climate emissions, but not for nature. So the first slide we see very small removal of domestic support, very small reductions in emissions, and very small reductions in land use. Environmental conditionality can give us bigger reductions in emissions. That's its design, that's the goal. But because we're lowering productivity, rather than raising productivity, we're going to need more land. And so we're going to need more agricultural land use change and more emissions from that. If we can hit the jackpot, if we can find innovations that raise productivity and lower emissions, we can get substantial reductions very substantial reductions in emissions and reductions in land use and emissions from land use change. So just some summary results. Next slide. And here we take into account all of our objectives, our economic objectives, our farm output objectives, social objectives, particularly poverty, and the costs of healthy diets. And so with eliminating existing support, negligible income gains, farmers are hurt, and there's really no gain in terms of food security. If we go to conditionality or payments for environmental services, potentially large emission reductions, but costly, and inducing increased land use, pulling out the chainsaws to make sure we have enough land to meet food demand. And with the green innovations, potentially wins all round, we can get gains in economic efficiency, we can get gains in farm output, we can see income growth, lower poverty, healthier diets, and well, as substantial reductions in emissions. So next slide, please. So key messages: it's very challenging to use carbon taxes in agriculture. They're unlikely to generate the needed incentives to change technique. We rely only on output reductions, and in that case, estimated impacts are modest. Rearranging current support doesn't yield game-changing outcomes. We need dramatic reductions in emissions. Introducing conditions via conditionality or payment for environmental services or regulation, we can reduce GHG emissions, but lower productivity, require land agricultural land expansion, raises costs of healthy diets. So what we find is investing in green innovations that raise yields, cut emissions, seems the most attractive approach. We can reduce emissions and we can reduce land use change. And there are new technologies becoming available that are very promising for achieving big reductions in emissions from those particular areas, from livestock and from rice, where emissions are most heavily concentrated. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you, Will. Very interesting results on what is feasible, what is not. The best design policies may not deliver the results or the multiple goals that we all seek to achieve. Another example of how carefully designed policies how policies need to be carefully designed. Moving quickly on to the fourth presentation, Fourth presentation is by Rob Voss, and it examines the political economy strategies that might be used to repurpose current agricultural support measures into measures that will be better, but that will better achieve their objectives. It will draw on experience from past reform efforts and upon the model-based analysis of the implications of different approaches to reform. Rob is a director of the Markets, Trade and Institutions divisions at IFPRI. Previously, he was director of Agriculture Development Economics at FAO, and responsible for economic analysis and policy support for sustainable agricultural development and food security. In that capacity, he was responsible for FAO's flagship publications, the State of Food Insecurity in the World and State of Food and Agriculture. At FAO, he also served as Director for Social Protection, Rural Employment, and Gender Equality, as coordinator of FAO's strategic strategic program for rural poverty reduction. Prior to his joining the FAO, he was Director for Development Policy and Analysis at the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs, where he directed the UN flagship publications on world economic situation and prospects and the World Economic and Social Survey. He was also Secretary of the UN Committee for Development Policy and coordinated the Secretary General's Millennium Development Goals GAP Task Force, as well as a UN task team for post-2015 UN Development Agenda. I think he's pretty well suited to talk to the issue of political economy. Over to you, Rob.
I'm trying to share my screen, but I can't see it myself. Is this working?
We see the bibliography of a long paper.
Okay, that's the wrong one. Okay, I'm sorry. Madhur, could you try and share my presentation? I sent it a few moments ago. Try again. There are too many screens open. I can't find the. Is this better?
Yep.
Yeah, we can see the presentation, but not on presentation mode.
Yep. Now it is. Yeah, it looks good.
All right. All right. Thanks, Madhur, for that introduction. And I also thank the previous speakers because they made my life easy, because a lot of the background I was going to present, they already presented. So we can just focus on what Madhur emphasized, is the political economy of reform. And this is based on a paper that we prepared with Will and with Danielle Resnick for the Food Systems Economic Commission. And we hope to get some feedback from you on this analysis. So ACCUP had 4 parts to present, so the problems with current support policies, but others have already covered that, so just run through that and then focus on what drives the political support for support policies that may not be the best ones, and what are the sources of change for political support that could support a repurposing agenda, and then how to move forward with such an agenda if that we find the political grounds to do so. So these points have already raised by others. The only point I want to emphasize in this slide, which is important, political economy aspect, is looking at the if one of our key objectives is to repurpose for reducing greenhouse gas emissions and fighting climate change, is this graph on, well, where the emissions come from, where we see that food system contributions to climate change first are mainly currently concentrated in developing countries, and increasingly so. And secondly, also what's important is that a decreasing share of those emissions come from either the pre or post-production processes and not directly related to agriculture. So we have to also be able to look beyond agriculture when we if we want to achieve reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, number one. And number two is also a point which Marco emphasized, is that current support is sort of biased against, in terms of magnitudes, the developing countries, if we include particularly China from that scheme, and whereas the bigger change and the bigger needs for making a dent into reducing greenhouse gas emissions would be in those countries. So it raises an issue of distribution within the political economy of repurposing. A framework that we've used for the analysis in the paper I refer to is 3 I's and a P, or actually 4 I's and a P. It's interest, it's about institutions, ideas and information, and about the nature of the policies and policy characteristics that all together define what is a win set for policy options, and where could we find both the obstacles to any reform as well as the opportunities for reform. So I guess political support for current policies is well known. It differs by countries. Farmers, even though a small share of the economically active population, typically are still pretty vocal interest groups. Urban consumers often benefit in poor countries from existing policies, particularly if it's geared towards cheap food policies, keeping food prices low. But it may differ from country to country, but very clearly interest groups that are directly affected by the policies have a big stake in either pushing for reform, but more often for keeping things into place. Ideas, information that could have to do with particular perceptions about what works, what doesn't work, or what should be done. A very popular form and with very persistent views is the idea of self-sufficiencies, that countries should be self-sufficient in their food production. We see still outcomes of that with after the COVID-19 lockdowns. We saw a whole bout of protectionist measures, particularly export restrictions by many countries to protect and insulate their consumers and keep production at home. And we've seen that again with the Ukraine crisis, with an even bigger spell of protectionist measures, all based on the ideas that trade is not the best instrument to insulate you against global food price shocks, but it's rather to protect you from those shocks directly through raising borders. Now, we as economists may say that's a misconception, but it's politically speaking, it's a very strong idea. And of course, policy effectiveness can be also in the minds of policymakers that have ideas in the right direction, like some of the ideas that Will alluded to, green innovations, and may have very high hopes of it. But very often those outcomes may be uncertain. Just to give one example, my own country in the Netherlands, where we've seen over the past months farmers rioting on the streets, threatening cabinet ministers, blocking food distribution centers, from policies that trying to restrict nitrogen emissions, or in general, where the Netherlands is very high intensity of nitrogen emissions, of which about 50% is on account of dairy farmers. So a couple of years ago, policymakers had this idea to reduce those emissions through innovations like introducing stable floors with drainage to avoid that the cow dung mixes with cow urine that produce ammonia, which is a very powerful greenhouse gas emission. And so they made all the farmers to keep their licenses to produce, to introduce those stable floors and invest in them. As it turns out now, that in practice, in theory, that worked well, sort of in the experimental design process that worked very well, but then in actual practice that didn't help reduce the emission or the production of ammonia, and hence also not the nitrogen and greenhouse gas emissions. So now farmers being forced probably to phase out from producing at all. About 50% of the dairy farmers are now being asked to leave production. So that, of course, is creating enormous political resistance, and that's on the basis of a perceived policy effectiveness idea by the government that didn't work in practice and now has to be changed. So uncertainties about policy effectiveness equally can be conducive of obstruction. Institutions, collective actions problems are important. Already mentioned quite a few. One country can insulate from price changes, but all countries, when they try and do it together, that won't work. There can be many other subsidies in play that one has to take into account when doing the repurposing on the agricultural and food policy front, like for instance many energy subsidies that can have a big impact on the production costs to farmers. So those have to be put into the equation as well. And lastly, policy characteristics matter. And of course, for this balancing act between collective objectives like fighting climate change and protecting individual interests like farm incomes, there can be big trade-offs. But of course, the policy characteristics and the policy drives are, what is the payoff? Can we see these results quickly or not? Will they benefit in the short run also the farmers or not? And of course, with investing in R&D, there will be long payoffs. And as a result, they may not require a lot of political support. So here's some options for reform. I think I won't dwell on these since Will already alluded to these and the scenarios that we did. But it's important, and that's why repeating these outcomes is that for the policy dialogues and for trying to achieve policy change, it will be very important to be able to show what are the likely co-benefits from the policy reform, as much as to be clear on who are the winners and losers and what be the possible trade-offs across the different reform measures, as also Marco emphasized. So for instance, in this presentation of the results, for instance, the cap reform for eco-service payments and for making farmers switch to organic farming. The key questions, for instance, that would be raised is that there may be some payoffs for the farm sector in terms of their direct incomes per worker, thanks to the in part for the payments, but all the other elements in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and making production more cheaper, the healthy foods, diets, healthy diets more cheaper, and the poverty reduction goals are not being served by those policies. But again, that's based on certain assumptions. First, will there be enough compensation payments for the eco-service payments to make farmers do this? And also, is the assumption that's underlying this scenario that organic reduced use of chemical fertilizers and more organic practices indeed are less productive than using those chemical fertilizer and pesticides. So what needs to be done is use these kind of frameworks to identify the outcomes, the potential gains on various fronts, the potential the cost of them, as well as who are the winners and losers in order to gain support for a reform agenda. And next is what can be done to make so what can we learn from existing policy reforms in order to gain the support for any reform agenda? There's some basis in terms of change that could be forged, and we see that with a number of reforms. There's more concerns about and awareness about the importance of sustainability, declining influence of some interest groups in some parts of the world that could help a better understanding of these policy impacts, including through the kinds of analysis that has been presented in the previous presentations. We may also have a lot more policy instruments that can complement the repurposing agenda. That could be through more effective macroeconomic policies, safety net constructions, and other measures that would be in place that would help forge such a reform. And it may also be a basis for internationally concerted action, and I'll show that in a few examples where existing multilateral frameworks, even if they may be in trouble in terms of ongoing negotiations like the WTO agricultural negotiations, they have proved to be instrumental to push for agricultural reforms in some contexts. And also the G7 and the G20 are advocating for joint action or for sustainable agriculture. So these are some signs for hope, but there will be big challenges moving forward as well. Again, I'll emphasize a few, but one of the big challenges for this agenda and all the scenario analysis that have been presented by Marco and by Will assume that all countries will go along with a repurposing agenda, and each by their own means. But as mentioned, the degrees of support vary quite a bit across countries, and subsequently, if we want to make an agenda that's particularly focused on global goals, particularly climate change goals, then that will be a first political economy obstacle, that not all countries are in the same position to make changes with the same magnitude.
Hi, Rob. Sorry, I think John has a hard stop at 9:30. So if you can wrap up in a couple of minutes, that'd be great. Thanks.
I'll
10:30.
Almost done. So there's 2 more slides. So here's a couple of examples, and let me just give the example of the reforms in China to emphasize that in the case of China, which initially was taxing agriculture, then shifted to strong support for agriculture, particularly over concerns over growing rural-urban wage gaps and the growing importance of farmers and agriculture for the industrialization strategies of China. But then the way it was done, particularly the accession to WTO, played a big role in limiting the amount of protection that was done through trade measures, and subsequently also a shift towards much more greater attention to trying to reduce emission intentions from agriculture based on these international commitments. But this underlines the point which I made earlier about the force that multilateral agreements can have. They haven't worked that well out in the case of India, but particularly also because of national political factors. One of those is very strong view still of food self-sufficiency that's prominent and predominant over environmental concerns, as well as India's federal system that's continuously giving conflict between the national and state government goals that conflict in terms of pushing forward nationally based reforms. Let me skip the other 2 and go to the conclusions. So the case for reform is very obvious. The current support delivers low value for money and is counterproductive on the whole for achieving climate food security and nutrition goals simultaneously. The global goals and uneven current support require international action, for which there's some basis, but the tricky parts will be, will it come along with international transfers? Will the awareness be sufficient? And also will it count for technology sharing, which will be important. But even though, for all the reasons I mentioned, resistance will be important, will be significant, and we should expect that. And so in order to achieve globally concerted reform agenda, it's important to lay clearly out the goals and the targets. That's also something, the example I gave for the Netherlands, that's said that after long political struggles, said, well, we're willing to renegotiate the way we implement the reform policy, but we're not going to tinker with the targets. And a focus on targets rather than on the tools can help forge more agreements and dialogue around the reform agenda. Clear identification of cost, gains, and trade-offs is critical. Multi-stakeholder dialogues are important, as again shown by the European reforms that go slowly, and the case of the Netherlands, which I mentioned, without multi-stakeholder dialogues, resistance can be much more forceful than one would expect upfront. Invest in R&D has proven to be less controversial, but also is of the long haul. So one would have to make the case quickly to provide incentives for the adoption of R&D measures and work with existing technologies. And largely leveraging international commitments can be very powerful means to leverage reform measures. So that's the hope for moving forward, but it's not going to be an easy ride. It's going to be a rocky road towards reform. Thank you.
Thanks, Rob. I'll skip the introductions in the interest of time. Sorry about that, John. John, can I hand it over to you?
Yes, that's good. So John Beghin at UNL. So let me just point a few, I really enjoy all the presentations and the papers. And so let me point a few, I would say, research questions or doubts I have about some elements. So on Leanne's piece, excellent summary of in a sense, all the challenges to try to harmonize or coordinate policies. One point I think is to know if consumers care, right? So what do they really care about sustainability? Do they read labels? Could be a generational issue, but there is a lot of work done on trying to measure willingness to pay for sustainability. And when it's done in more realistic, say, shopping environments, that willingness to pay sometimes is very small. So I just wonder about that. Also, another point is on harmonization or reciprocity of standards. I think that's hard to achieve, right? We see the WTO on SPS issues, for instance, as an abysmal record on trying to put in place reciprocity or of course not even harmonizing or having countries following international standards. So I have doubts that harmonization or reciprocity of environmental standards is going to be something easy to achieve. Marco's presentation also very enjoyable. I think there was just one doubt, maybe I misunderstood, but price effects in 2020 were not there, right? I mean, the food insecurity was created by income loss and the recession rather than and the restriction put in place to restrict economic activity. And prices, of course, in 21-22 went through the sky. But so that's just a small correction. I think the access to healthy diet, I'm not sure to understand exactly what healthy diet is. I think there are many definitions. For instance, the Lancet Commission wants everybody to eat organic, right, on the planet. Then that's not feasible, of course. I think the point on R&D going for healthier diet is good, and that's what a point that also made by Will later. Another interesting point I found was the heterogeneity of support across commodities. That was quite interesting as well. I think one issue is that we all, as trade economists, we all take trade as a given, and trade is the enemy when you go to talk to ecologists. For instance, you look at the work by Ruth de Vries at Columbia, and she has papers showing that trade is really associated with deforestation, for instance, and that basically the policy implication is that trade is the enemy. And so I think that's we need to engage non-economists in our debate. Another question I have is that is the Miragro-DEP model able to put R&D shifters and looking into say lowering the cost of healthy food items. I like the case study of Ethiopia on the job creation of with off-farm jobs. That's I think Ethiopia is dear to me for some private reasons, but I think that's good. A very interesting exercise. Also, I think there is a need for complementary policy action and support in education. So you want the next generation to be able to exit farming, so rural transition can take place. And so I think that in that complex slide of all the complementarity policies needed or institutions, education should be prominent. Will, enjoyable as always. Let me make a few points. Let me be a Nebraska economist. So, beef in Nebraska is a big thing. And so every time somebody attack beef, we're supposed to say something. So no, there is a new evidence on methane that is being progressively put in place. There is a guy called Frank Mitloner at UC Davis Clear Center that is very interesting on, in a sense, reconsidering the established wisdom on this equivalence between CO2 and methane. There is also an Oxford-based paper by Lynch and co-author on also those equivalents of methane. So there is an emerging body of evidence, in a sense, challenging those older CO2 equivalents. And so I would say the evaluation of the impact of beef on climate may be to be reconsidered. I think one aspect, today resilience was mentioned a few times, but very little is done on I think there is an overemphasis on global house gases, global warming gases, and resilience is a big thing, right? So we can try to really reduce emissions, but the resilience aspect, I think, is very important, right? Addressing second moments in the climate change. So let me, of course, I love those results on green innovation, and I think that's where we should see land-grant schools like Iowa State and UNL invest more in R&D on fruits and vegetables rather than more on corn and wheat. Rob's piece also very interesting. I like the aspect, I really like the case studies of China in particular, and the one on US biofuel, and the mention of the work by Lark and co-authors in PNAS, which really shows that land use effects actually were very small during the RFS and the expansion, but what really has been really deteriorating is the water pollution, and basically water pollution is one of the major emphasis and negative impact of the RFS, the renewable fuel standard. And a leading question to this is the fact that we have an expansion of renewable diesel, right? And so renewable diesel is a different process, but still based on oilseed and vegetable oil. And so what will be the impact of this expansion that many people in the private sector and in policy environment are seeing with renewable diesel and even also with drop-in corn-based gasoline, right? And so those are fully renewable fuels that are incentivized by CARB and other Western states. And so what will be really the land use impact? What will be the water use impact of these new fuels? And so that's, let me stop here. And I apologize, I really have to go teach. The students may not like it if I'm late. So thanks a lot.
Thanks.
Yeah, and so that's all I had to say. So
Thank you, John, and
Yeah.
sorry for the delay. And I know you also have a hard stop. Are you able to?
Yeah. You know, since we're just mainly talking to ourselves at this point, maybe I can make a few other comments that I might not have made in a wider context. So first of all, we have here the major organizations who are doing modeling and analysis in this area. There may be a few others, but we're pretty much everybody is here. If I were a policymaker, I would be so confused by the wealth, overabundance actually of information and analysis that's coming out. But for somebody like me who's been following this stuff, you know, I can see commonalities across all the presentations. What I would love to see is one paper coming out from IFPRI, FAO, OECD, World Bank, WTO, saying these are the key conclusions that we see cutting across all these different models, all this different analysis that we're doing about where we should be going and where the costs are, where the benefits are, et cetera. So that's one thing. It's kind of inside baseball, but really, really important if we're going to move this whole conversation forward. The second point I would make, and I'm going to focus, you know, just on the analytical piece or the more analytical pieces, is, you know, I love this focus on R&D. I mean, I think it's great, but it's too long term. We need to, one, identify what's the off-the-shelf technologies. There's tons of technologies that the universities are sitting on, that others are sitting on, that aren't being implemented. And if we're just waiting for R&D, it could be 10, 15 years that for farmers to see those gains or consumers to see those gains. So what are the off-the-shelf technologies that are there? And what are the short-term wins? What are the short-term wins that on the policy side that we can salve the system with while we're waiting for that? The other point is, I think we need to look for what I would call small but meaningful changes. And, you know, there's some of the sort of leverage points that come out from some industrial policy readings. But, you know, for example, the Agree Coalition in the States has been really focusing on if you get farmers to use cover crops, how much does that reduce the risk of crop failure? And how much can you then reduce their insurance premiums, their crop insurance premiums, right? It's not a big change, but it's a key change if you start getting farmers to see the link between changing a production practice and actually benefits to their bottom line. So we need to kind of find those leverage points that are not big headline policy changes, but are going to make a difference in how people think and how they behave. The other thing I want to say is I love the points that were made, I forget which paper it was, now on optimizing budgets. So, you know, if we assume that we're not going to have a lot more money to make these changes, how can, and maybe it was the Ethiopia point, you know, how can within the budget envelope policies become more efficient than what they are in terms of delivering on goals? But the other piece there to add is, you know, we're all talking about this as if the only money that we have available is what's currently being spent on farm bills and cap policies. You know, in the US, there are certain states have moved in this direction, but, you know, Medicaid money that's being made available for prescriptions for fruits and vegetables So how can we look at sort of a bigger picture of healthcare spending that could be used to support healthy diets and therefore drive, changes back into the market, and the same, school feeding programs. I mean, there's a lot of these kinds of things that it's outside the ag budget, but because it's having implications on the budgets for healthcare, there might be ways to pull that money in and create the incentives that we're talking about. And then the last thing I would say is economists are great, and we've seen it in the presentations here, at myth busting, right? And sort of the myth busting that the Food and Land Use Coalition did and the Food System Economics group is going to be doing on the value destruction in this sector. The importance, I think, and John alluded to this, we all have been focusing on productivity, right? And what if we go to regenerative agriculture, it may lower productivity? Maybe, I don't necessarily buy that, maybe, but what do we gain in terms of resilience? What do we gain in terms of stability? And we're not equalizing those values, right? We're too drummed into productivity and not into stability. So I think that's an area that a group of economists can do some work on. The other point, the last point I would make is the IFPRI study that showed basically developing countries are where most of these emissions are coming from. I mean, that's a big myth buster, right? Because the narrative always has been it's the rich countries that are causing creating the greenhouse gas emission problems. So if we can start saying, we need to focus more on addressing the climate change implications in developing countries, I think that would be really, really helpful in terms of the narrative. But the last thing I would say, and people are now leaving, the last thing I would say is in the Food System Economics Commission conversation I had with them a few days ago, they're talking about, transferring money from the North to the global South to deal with these problems. That's a non-starter from a political point of view. And we really also need to get the US and EU and others to move in order for the global political economy conversation. So I'll leave it there. I'm sorry. It's unfortunate, Will, we didn't have, more external people, but, quality over quantity. And I hope that as we heard from each other, some of these points can kind of percolate in our heads about how we need to move this debate forward. So thanks.
Well, thanks, Anne. Very, very relevant and pertinent points. Yeah, I think having a common sort of position and a paper is extremely important. I think the benefit of the results and some of these sessions is that it kind of shows that coming at it from different angles and different approaches, you're getting pretty much this similar answers. So I think that's an important point, because one can always say that, well, yeah, that's a one-off and so on. So, but it's overdue. Just one last point on the developing countries, and Rob, this is also to you. I think one of the things we need to do there is to look at who the big players, and I think in this case, if you take China out,
yeah,
you really see the developing countries, the picture changes dramatically. And this was one thing, both on the support side, and I believe also on the emissions and that side. I think it's important to distinguish. Question is, where does China really belong, for example? And once you take that, then you say, well, maybe it's not so clear cut when we look at the emissions. But anyway, we don't want to get into the detailed discussion here. But Rob, you have your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, but just a few quick points. These are great comments, and thanks for that, and also good suggestions. On one single paper, we have at least two, but they may not be good enough. So we did like 2 rounds of briefs for the T20, the think tank 20 to inform the G20 may not have been good enough to to sway all the opinions or to get this bigger or higher on the agenda, but it is on the agenda, but maybe without much action. Also for the G7, there was a paper prepared across the various institutions. Again, questions were, was the paper good enough, right? But certainly I take the point we should do more to bring these views together and say, well, there's we can have all kinds of scenarios, but the core messages are the same. And here are the issues that you should be thinking about. So I think that point is very well taken. On your point, maybe I'm mistaking it from small versus big. But what we need to do is to think big, right? If we don't think big, we won't achieve anything. But maybe your point is that we need to start making gains and immediate gains soon in order to show that this can be done. And also, it's one point I was raising is that there are many technologies on tap. They're being tried out, but not all of them in practice work as well as you think they do. So the Dutch example is one of them with these new stable floors, and so it's a perfect idea. But in practice, it doesn't work, and now they're pushing for old-fashioned, better practices, meaning get the cows out more often into the field and have them graze just pasture and not being all that long in the stables and so on. But whether that's a solution, something else. But we do have many technologies on tap. Not all of them are easily adaptable. They may be, and that's where the incentive structure is very important. So as we think of investing more in R&D, for me, it's as much as investing in improving existing technologies and practices as investing in making farmers and other producers adopt those technologies and experiment with it and be willing to make mistakes. So that's also the policy front. We should be accepting the changes.
I'm really sorry that I have to go. I have other people waiting on me at a meeting, so I apologize, but appreciate your comments, Rob. So
okay, well, thanks.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks, and Marco.
Okay, but just to finish the point, and then give it to Marco, since now we're just amongst ourselves, truly. So in terms of presentation, I think Anne made a good point, sort of in misbusting how you present things. And like I would say, the point that was raised not so much as to showcase that developing countries have the major share of the emissions from food systems, even true as it may be. But more general is to show that more action on the ground is needed in those countries where the resources may be less. And that's where the importance comes in, not just in thinking repurposing what governments can do and change it and then even do it in a concerted way, but also to give those countries a lot more means to act upon it. And then that could be also aligned with other sources of funding. But that's where the two things have to come together, right? And I do recall when we were doing the 2016 the state of food and agriculture in the world reports on climate change. There was one issue which I tried to bring in, but it was very difficult to get in. So it's a whole chapter on climate finance towards agriculture, to bring in the whole repurposing discussion, the incentive discussion as part of that agenda. So, well, if we don't do the latter thing, then the first thing may just be more money going to waste rather than being properly used if the market incentives are not there and the existing policy structures and the related incentive schemes work in the same directions as they're doing now.
Thanks, Rob. Marco?
Just very quickly, I mean, I really like Anne's point on having all the parties together and agree on a paper, but I think the issue there is actually how do we get the agenda into the table of the WTO, because we can all get together, and probably most of us already agree on the issue. How it is done in practice will depend. But one of the issues I've been saying to these rural transition colleagues is that if you don't get the WTO on the table, then it's very hard to move beyond the subsidies discussion that you can have with countries. So I think that's one thing. But how do you get countries to act on this? Is basically it's going to happen when you have a few champions, and that's why I have discussed this with Madhur as well. We got a little bit tired already of the proliferation of studies, because as Rob said, we already have papers. The T20 paper, it's there, whatever. The papers are there. Now what we have decided to do is just try to work with a couple of countries, work with Ethiopia, with Uganda, with the Ministry of Finance, and show them how the same money will give them more value if they optimize the budgets, and how, and you can start adding things up. Education, the education point that was done is important, and I also mentioned that can we tap into resources from other systems? Yes, but then it requires a big policy coordination, right? That goes beyond the agricultural sector. Of course, if you bring in money in education, social protection, school feeding, you will have gains. But again, the bottom line being is like, for me, in summary, we need to get the WTO on the table. I don't know how we could do that. We can think about it together. And second, we need a few champions. What I can tell you that on behalf of FAO, we're trying to do that through the MAFA program, have 1 or 2 countries where we're already doing headway on repurposing. And once we can show that they can do better with the same money, and they do reform on the ground, believe me, this is what we want to present in global forum, right? And in policy dialogues. And then others will follow. That's what I wanted to say.
Great, thank you.
No, I agree. I think, Marco, as you mentioned, as we discussed also in Rome, I think it's important to identify those 1 or 2 countries where we can actually move to implementation, move and support action. I think Ethiopia is one example. Another one that I mentioned was also Bangladesh. So let's see how things develop over the next couple of months or so, and then make sure that the FAO team is involved in that directly. Great. I think maybe, Rob, it might be worthwhile to think about the T20 paper seems to have been buried in the T20 dungeons. Maybe what we need to do is bring it out and go back and, really what I've learned from our communications team, and then I'm sure you have from yours, is that we need to get some simple English-speaking people to get at the paper. We invariably go into a jargon and then say that what are
just for your information. So the T20 paper is out, so it's online, it's available, and also it's mentioned. Repurposing mentioned twice in the T20 summary that will go to the T20 summit, or that's gone to the T20 summit. The problem, of course, is that as that came out, the discussions on the communique for the G20 agriculture ministerial meeting had already been almost concluded. They concluded
we had
21 paragraphs minus 1, which probably they'll never conclude. So there may not be a communique after all, because they didn't know how to agree on wording about the war in Ukraine, as you can imagine. But all the other paragraphs were agreed upon. Then there's sort of a vague mention of right incentives, as well as more investing in R&D, which in the last minute I managed to get into that communique. Anyway, but you're right. So it's going to be very hard. But one thing, as I was talking to Martin the other day when I met him at some reception at the Netherlands embassy, there will be a joint finance minister and agricultural minister meeting of the G20 on the 11th of October. And that will be a forum where we could lobby to get this more forefront. So the key thing is with what language can you come that would sort of surmount all the other struggles who are there. Main focus there, of course, will be what can be done immediately to alleviate populations from rising cost of their food baskets. But within that, bringing in some scope for doing something on the existing policies and using the current crisis as a reason to do so would be something we should look into rather quickly.
Yeah, there seems to be some resistance to repurposing. We had also sent strong recommendations and points on the repurposing in the G20 communique, and then I think there's a lot of political economy behind the scenes that goes on. I mean, even including, I think US often objects to some of these terminologies. So I don't know what the issue is, but
well, I think the bigger issue there is not so much with, on that front at least, with the US. It's more with developing countries, right? So the developing countries.
we've had resistance also on the US side. But anyway, good. I think anybody else?
No, I just wanted to say that we haven't scared people by sometimes by using too much the word subsidies. That scares a lot of people. I have refrained from using subsidies and I use agricultural policy support in the broader sense, because that opens up, some possibilities to put it across the policy makers, But for some reason, some people equated subsidies to the whole agricultural support that is out there, and subsidies is very politically charged, right? And scares a lot of governments. So probably we need to do some work on how we sell these things as well, so that we don't scare governments from the entrance.
Yeah, we have taken the word subsidy out on all of our communications, which is basically focused on support. Yeah.
I thought Anne made a really good point, though, that we had the key organizations that do this sort of analytical work, and we're all using very, very similar frameworks. And that hasn't always been the case. So, I think OECD, FAO, the World Bank, IFPRI, this is a wonderful thing, and we should take advantage of it. And I just want to take advantage of this opportunity to thank everyone too for participating. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for organizing
this.
this.
Thank you for chasing.
Well, in the end, so how many non-presenter participants did we have? I think I counted 10 at one point, including ourselves.
And there was a bit of
11.
rotation of the non-presenters, so maybe half a dozen. But yeah, it's a real structural problem with these meetings, because people sign up when they're at the conference, and then it looks like they forget, So we had several people there I'd never heard of, who I think were ones who had registered, but there were another 20 who had signed up. So, and then of course, non-registered delegates in principle can't attend, although they can, if they have the link. So, and thank you, Valeria, for using that link.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to hang out here.
No, but I think one problem here with this is, since it's sort of on a completely different, maybe an odd or a random moment, right after the AAEA conference, right? So you basically should treat this as a completely new seminar and have a new dissemination strategy, because otherwise people forget. Even I had forgotten about it until you started remembering, hey, you have to give a presentation next week, right?
Yep. I tried to remind everyone regularly to keep it. Anyway, good. I think we've probably run out of time, Mr. Chair.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Bye.
For
Thanks.
keeping things under control. Thank you.
Thank you.
Not quite, but yeah.
We survived.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, Rob. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.